my Father's world, and to my listening ears, all nature sings, and round me rings the music of the spheres. This is my Father's world. I rest me in the thought of rocks and trees, of skies and seas. His hand the wonders wrought. This is my Father's world. The birds their carols raise, the morning light, the lily white, declare their Maker's praise. This is my Father's world. He shines in all that's fair.
This is 20 Pages a Week. We are live with Jared Saltz today. We are studying Joshua and Judges. Jared is a professor at Florida College, originally from Central Alabama, and now living in the Tampa, Florida area. Jared, thank you very much for joining. Are you there?
Oh, I'm glad to be here. I think our weather's probably a little bit better than yours.
I have
Can you hear me?
confidence that it is not worse, that's for sure. We are on the verge of the end of the ice apocalypse, and we are glad to be there. We may actually get out in the road today.
I hope everybody's going safe and going well.
Yes, absolutely. This is a challenging week for our study. Joshua and Judges is, I believe, the longest reading in the entire curriculum, and it comes on the heels of some challenging readings before this, which were long in and of themselves. So if you have gotten this far in the reading, congratulations. Way to stick with it. It will get easier from here. This is the longest quarter reading-wise of the four, and we are about halfway through. So congratulations for this, and do not grow weary in well-doing. So we're at Joshua and Judges, and we're going to break this up a little bit and talk about the two of them separately. Jared, why don't you start with Joshua and give me your first impressions?
Sure. Joshua is a fantastic read, and it's great in a few different ways. Because at first, everything looks incredible. You've got this initial success. You've got all these wonderful stories. You know, everybody knows the story of Jericho. Everybody, the kids love singing, the walls come tumbling down. You have this incredible success in the north when you fight against Hazor, which is described as the head of all these kingdoms. You take Jerusalem. You get Joshua and Caleb. They're defeating the Canaanites. You've got good, godly leadership. You've got a faithful generation, and everybody's doing the right things. And the conquest is going smoothly. You think, oh man, this is fantastic. We are fulfilling the promises that God made to Abraham back in Genesis chapter 12. They've been fruitful and multiplied in Egypt. It's time for them to take the land, and you just think now is the time. They're going to become now a blessing to all of the nations of the world, just like God promised. And there's kind of lurking in the background maybe this idea that what's going to happen? How are they going to be a blessing to all the nations? Are everybody around them going to see how great God is? And you get a little inkling of that even at the very beginning with Rahab, where that exact thing happens. And maybe the Canaanites are going to convert and become Israelites.
Right. But they don't, do they? and that's the way it oftentimes is.
They don't, but that's really more about Judges. Yeah.
And we'll get to that in
so
due course
it's just
of time. Absolutely. Well, tell me one story that you really strikes you in the book of Joshua.
So the story that I think just stands out for a lot of different reasons, and this is probably the story that a lot of people would pick. It is the story of Jericho, especially with Rahab. And we know the story pretty well. This is one of those stories that, even people who've not grown up in the pew, who haven't attended a lot of church, they just kind of have learned through just being part of culture. And we can kind of review the story and see how it plays out in Joshua chapter 2, that Joshua sends 2 spies to scout out the land, and particularly Jericho. Jericho is the first real city in Canaan, kind of that middle area right across the Jordan River. And we see, like we saw in chapter 1, that there's all these different echoes of what Moses has done, but it's a little bit different. So Moses sends 12 spies to scout out the land, and there were only 2 of them that were faithful, Joshua and Caleb. And Joshua was like, this time we're going to do things different. We're only going to send 2 spies into the land. Maybe they'll be faithful. And they go into Jericho to see everything goes on. They go into the house of this prostitute, and we can kind of figure out what's going on there. And they're noticed. And they're in danger, and we don't know what's going to happen. The kingdom sends people to go and check on them. The guards find out, hey, what happened to those 2 men that came into you? They weren't from around here. What's going on with them? But Rahab conceals them on her roof, hides them until they're gone. And she comes and she tells them in verses 9 through 13, I know the Lord has given you the land, and the fear of you has fallen on us. And all the inhabitants of the land, they're melting away before you, because we've heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea before you when you came out of Egypt. And we've heard what you did to the kings of the Amorites on the other side of the Jordan, to Sihon and Og, to whom you devoted destruction. And as soon as we heard it, our hearts melted, and there was no spirit left in any man because of this, because of the Lord your God. He is the God of the heavens above and on the earth beneath. So now, therefore, please swear to me by the Lord, that as I have been good to you, that you will be good to me and to my father's house, and give me a sure sign that will save my father, my mother, my brothers, my sisters, and everybody else, and deliver us from death. And this is an incredible story. First of all, we're like, well, where did she learn about God? How does she know he's the Lord? She seems to know better about the Lord than the Israelites did in Egypt. How's all this going on? But exactly. The more you think about it and the more you read it, there's even more incredible things about this, because it answers so many questions that we've had. For example, a lot of the times people are like, why did God harden Pharaoh's heart? Well, we have here a partial answer, because God knows that Pharaoh has sinned and he's already made his decision. But by displaying his power among the Egyptians, other people will see it and will be saved. Rahab references what God does to Pharaoh. He references these other actions. And so we have a little bit of an idea there given by Rahab what God's purposes were. It wasn't just to judge Pharaoh, although that would have been good enough. It wasn't just to judge the Egyptian gods, although that would have been enough. One of the reasons for God's actions there is to save people like Rahab. And she says everybody knows about the Lord. Everybody's terrified of him, but she's the one who decides, hey, I need to make this right. I have an opportunity here to show kindness and to be saved and to have this become part of the people. And of course, we know what happens. As you mentioned in your 20 pages, here's this person who not only is a transformed person, like, hey, she went from being a Canaanite to an Israelite, or from a prostitute to not. She's in the lineage of Jesus. And that is about as high of a position as you get. I mean, she's joining with the characters like Abraham or David or Ruth, as you're going to talk about next time. Mm-hmm. And this story provides then this glimpse into this broader program of what God is doing. And I think Terry and Philip will be excited about this, because and you said you were almost onto this about going back to the garden as well. I think we have a bit of a garden image here as well. If you think about what God has planned for Adam and Eve when they're in the garden, we can kind of get an idea based on the commands that he gave them. He gives them really 2 main commands, positive commands. The one is to be fruitful and multiply, and the other is to tend and care for the garden. And when you see those 2 commands together, it seems pretty clear that what God wants them to do is to spread the garden throughout the entire world, to take this one oasis and make it spread everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
We read in Exodus and then coming into Joshua that God has multiplied and made fruitful the Israelites. And now he's bringing them into Canaan, which is described as a Edenic-like land flowing with milk and honey. And the question is, are they going to tend and grow the land? Are they going to be a blessing to the nations? Are, like we had a mixed multitude come up with the people from Egypt, are we going to have these people become part of the biblical story by converting or not?
Mm-hmm.
And I think this helps make sense of some of the questions about the conquest, is that God's primary purpose in here is not to go and kill off all the Canaanites, or to bring this genocide, to prune the garden, as it were,
right,
to grow it. And that the Rahab story, I think, shows God's primary directive, which is to convert all the people. And that, of course, is ultimately an example of Jesus, who himself is Joshua, right? Jesus is Joshua. It's the same name. And he's also going to conquer sin and conquer all of the world, not just Israel, but the entire world. But how he does it, of course, is going to be different from how they do it in Joshua. And I think this story is just really incredible to look at it that way.
Well, and that parallel, the spiritual parallel, is striking. There are a lot of stories in the Jesus story that mimic this, where there's the faith of the people on the inside that obviously is at a different level. The people who've been spending 40 years in the wilderness with Moses, they are at a different place than Rahab is. But in a very real sense, the ascent of Rahab's faith is more impressive than the static or even declining status of the faith of the Israelites, which is not to say that Rahab made it all the way or that she fully realized who the God of heaven was, but we recognize and admire people who are growing, people who are developing. And instead of just walking into the land of Canaan and saying, okay, here we are, we're the people of God, we inherit, it's God expects us to move forward and make a difference, if only for the reasons that you're saying there, to have an impact on the others. And not to just flatter Philip too much, but remember the last time Edenic imagery was used with regard to the land of Canaan. It was the territory surrounding Sodom and Gomorrah.
Mm-hmm.
That was like the garden of God. And God was not satisfied with what happened in his garden, and he destroyed it. Likewise, and this is getting ahead to the judge's story a little bit. Once you get into the land, there is work for you to do in this place. You have not just arrived so that you can arrive. You've arrived to do work, and we're not always willing to do that.
Right. Yep. Exactly.
Well, give me one Joshua verse that really jumps out at you.
Okay, so the one verse from Joshua, and I'm going to cheat just a tiny bit. It's going to be 2 verses, but it's really only one sentence.
Okay.
So it's from Joshua chapter 24, verses 14 and 15. And it says, now therefore, yeah, I know, right? Now therefore, fear the Lord and serve him in sincerity and in faithfulness. Put away the gods that your fathers served beyond the river and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. And if it is evil in your sight to serve the Lord, choose this day whom you're going to serve, whether it's the gods your fathers served in the region beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whom land you now dwell. But as for me and for my house, we will serve the Lord. Now, you kind of joked at of course this is, because everybody wants to focus in on the, as for me and for my house, we will serve the Lord. And, how many people do you have that verse like displayed like on like a placard or something in your house? Or?
I'm not sure if I do. Got a lot of them. We may have that one.
But I like looking a little bit deeper at what Joshua's doing here in chapter 24. And notice how he's speaking about this really faithful generation, like you just talked about. They've been raised 40 years on the manna. What does Joshua say they're doing? He says, put away the gods that your fathers served. If they have to put them away, what are they still worshiping? Mm-hmm. Those gods. God has brought them out of Egypt, and they're still serving the idols. God has brought them into Canaan and given them the land, and they're still serving these idols. And you kind of have this continual back and forth in this verse between Joshua and the people, where Joshua's like, listen, you need to choose the gods you're going to serve. And in the next 3 verses, they're like, oh, we always choose the Lord. And Joshua says in the next few verses, no, you don't. And they're like, yes, we do. And Joshua says, oh, are you willing to call God as a witness against you? And they said, sure, God will be a witness against us if we, don't do the right thing. And he's like, well, are you going to put away your idols now? They're like, oh, we only serve the Lord. And then he ends with making this covenant that the people have. And they make the covenant. And up to that point, we've been feeling pretty positive about this whole Joshua thing and about all the people there.
Mm-hmm.
But the very fact is, here at the very end of Joshua's life, they're still serving idols. We think,
Portent of future events.
oh no, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because this is, how do we term these guys? They're the faithful generation, right? We think of them as the most faithful generation of Israelites. And they're still idolaters. And yet God has been with them. And God has given them, God is trying to transform them the same way as he tried to transform Rahab.
Mm-hmm.
And that tells me God's trying to transform us as well.
Well, maybe you would have some kind of insight into this. I don't know, but I'm ahead in the reading a week. I'm into 1 Samuel, and where Michal is saving David's life, and she takes the teraphim,
The ephod, that's the ephod,
and puts it in the bed. And going back to the Rachel story, Rachel steals her household idols. This icon, this teraphim, the images seem to be a very powerful part of this culture in this area, maybe beyond simply worshiping foreign gods. Why are they so connected to these images?
It's a great question. I mean, one of the things that Israel does differently from everybody else, it's not that they have a God that they're supposed to worship. Everybody's got a God they're supposed to worship.
Right.
And it's not even that they have one God they're supposed to worship, because in the nations around Canaan, so like the Edomites and the Moabites, they all have one God they're supposed to worship. They believe in other gods, but they're only supposed to worship, Milcom or Molech or whatever else. The thing that's the strangest for Israel is that they're not supposed to have an image of the God. They're not supposed to have an idol.
Right.
And for us, this seems obvious, right? Because we're kind of raised in this culture that, even if you, again, weren't raised Christian, it's just our culture. We don't think about idols in that way. But there, you have something that you can see, that you can touch, that you can view, that you have a focus. And the understanding, it was never just that the idol was God, but the idol was the avatar for God. And so if you put him in your temple, he was kind of stuck there in a way. And so if you brought him out, he had to come with you. This is, if you're a week ahead, this is exactly what the people end up thinking about the ark, right? They just turn the ark into an idol. Well, if we take the ark into battle, God will have to fight for us. We can kind of force his hand. And just as the people have taken this because they think, hey, now you can control God if you can control his idol.
Mm-hmm.
That is the thing.
So
it allows you to control him.
You think the teraphim is a representation of Yahweh?
Now, on the teraphim, the household gods, maybe not. They're, and this is a complicated question, so I don't want to be definitive on this, but they are probably, it's more related to like an ancestor cult, which would be ways you would divine answers. So if you read in Ezekiel, or if you read in Jeremiah, or even in the Psalms, the people are worshiping the cult of the dead or their ancestors. Mm-hmm. And the idea was that they would kind of interact with gods for you. It's not the same, but the closest analog that might make sense to us would be like praying through the saints. Right. Again, it's not the exact same, but that's an analog that might help us make sense of that.
Well, that makes sense in the Rachel context, because that seems to be having to do with inheritance and family identity and that sort of thing. Okay.
Right.
All right.
Exactly.
Well, bonus points for Jared throwing in some stuff that was not on topic. Okay, great. If you had one word, what would the
one word? And this is, I think, probably the word you would choose too, just based on where you kind of started out, and it's courage in Joshua. In Joshua 1, we read that Moses is dead. And this finds us in an entirely new situation, one that Israel's never, as a nation, has never been before. Moses has been with them from the beginning. And God comes to Joshua and he says, listen, arise, right? And go and do what I've told you to do. And over and over again in chapter 1, we read that the people are supposed to be strong and courageous. And at first we're like, oh, be strong and courageous. We know the story of Joshua. It means to go fight, be strong and courageous and fight for the battle. But when you read a little further, you realize that that's not exactly what he means. Because in verses 7 through 9, he says, be strong and courageous. Well, what does that mean? He says, by being careful to do the law that Moses commanded you. Don't turn from aside from the right or the left, and then you will have success wherever you go. The book of the law should depart from your mouth. If you meditate on it day and night and be careful to do what's written in it, then you'll be prosperous. Then you'll have success. Then you'll conquer the land. This being courageous business isn't like, hey, be a great warrior and learn how to fight a sword or grab a gun or whatever else. It's be courageous enough to do what God's commanded you to do. Be courageous to study. Be courageous to live according to God's word. Because the reason they were going to win is the same reason they won Jericho. It wasn't because they're like, oh, we're just super awesome, warrior ninjas from the desert who can go and storm this city with like SEAL Team 6. All they did was walk around. But that's what God had told them to do. And if they'd have followed God's commands and done what he said, then no one would be able to prevail against them. But instead, they hear be courageous, and they're like, oh, well, we've got to do this ourselves. Mm-hmm. It's kind of like what happens in the New Testament when Jesus is talking about the kingdom, and they're like, oh, I know what that means. And Jesus says, no, you don't.
You don't. We're working on it, though.
Exactly.
The abruptness of the introduction there really strikes me. Moses, my servant, is dead. Mm-hmm. And that seems like almost rude, because surely Moses meant everything to Joshua. But remembering the context in the end of Deuteronomy, where Moses goes up in the mountain, does not come down, I can't help wondering if maybe there's some lingering thought in Joshua's mind. Maybe we're not done with Moses yet. Yeah. Maybe Moses will come down. Maybe Moses will be able to carry on the work a little bit longer. 10% of his mind thinking that way. And God comes to Joshua and says, we're done with that now. Moses is dead. You're never going to see his body, but you have to believe me, he's dead. It's your time now. It's your time to go and do what Moses did. And that's what every generation goes through. And Joshua following up on Deuteronomy, Judges following up on Joshua, you talked about that already. This new generation has to decide for itself, where do we stand? Are we going to stand with God? Speaking of which, Terry Francis is giving you a hard time about picking the same verse that everybody else would pick from Joshua.
Yeah, but I probably didn't go the same place they did. Everybody's like, oh, look, it's so good. And I'm like, yeah, it really wasn't. Yeah. But no, I think you're exactly right about that. And the reason I think that is not just because we don't have a ton of information there, but because we see the same exact scene play out in the transition between 1 Kings and 2 Kings, where Elijah, who is a Moses figure, dies. And even though Elisha knows it, he still allows the sons of the prophets to kind of get him to keep on looking. Mm-hmm. And he literally receives the mantle, right? And again, Elijah too goes up to heaven, it's kind of buried by, God knows not where. And so we have that same sort of thing. It's funny, a lot of books of the Old Testament begin with the death of the last main character. We get that in, 1 Kings with the death of David. You get it in 2 Samuel after the death of Saul. So this is a thing that occurs a lot. And again, like you said, the question is, how is this generation going to do? Are they going to do better than last generation? Because that's a low bar. Or are they going to somehow trip over it as well?
Absolutely. And Elijah and Elisha crossed the Jordan River also.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not going the other way, obviously, but all right, great.
And they, split the river and all the other thing too. So yeah, you're definitely, when you get there, that's absolutely a Joshua 1. Like there's like 12 different little connection points. So yes. You're exactly right.
Very good point. All right, well, let's move on to Judges. What are your first impressions of Judges?
Well, if everything looked great in Joshua, everything looks terrible in Judges. All of those key moments of successes that we read, the destruction of Jericho, of Hatzor, of Jerusalem, it's all wiped away. When we read about Ehud, well, his bad guy is living in the city of the palms. That's Jericho. It's a Canaanite city again. We have welcome to the new Jabin in the story of Deborah and Barak. The same as the old Jabin, still living in Hatzor, which now is another Canaanite city. And even though in chapter 1, we're like, hey, look, Jerusalem was defeated by Caleb, and then you get Othniel stuff. By the end of the story, it's Jabus again. Every success that they had in Joshua has been rolled back. In fact, just as they met the commander of the army of the armies of the Lord, in Joshua, and he's like, hey, I'll fight for you. He shows up in Judges and says, actually, I'm fighting against you because y'all didn't keep the covenant that you said you were going to keep. Mm-hmm. It's awful. I mean, the leaders fail to lead or else leave badly. The priests fail to lead or else leave badly. Husbands and fathers fail to lead or else lead badly. The weak and the poor and the women are sometimes quite literally sacrificed. And those promises that we thought were coming to fulfillment, that God made to Abraham of land and seed and blessing, they seem to be in jeopardy because rather than the Canaanites becoming like Israel, Israel is becoming like the Canaanites.
Mm. That's what we do. You know, we're brought into the kingdom, and the crossing the Jordan metaphor. All you have to do is pick up a hymnal to realize how important a metaphor that is. And in a sense, it has futuristic tones, but there's a very real sense in which we cross the Jordan in life. We enter into this new promised land that God has given us. He was promising all these spiritual blessings in the heavenly places, and now we have them. We've landed. Now what are we going to do? I had a half an hour tirade on for a class online Wednesday about this. We've arrived, but we don't look any different from the people that we're around. We're supposed to be making this positive impact, but far too often it's the other way around, that we're becoming just like the tribes that we were supposed to be driving out. We're supposed to be having a positive impact, an impact for God in this, and it's not working out that way.
Yeah. And what we see kind of going along with that is, the parable when Jesus says, there's a person and he casts out a demon and he doesn't fill it with anything. And then, all the other demons come back and becomes such a worse son of hell than he ever was before. That's Judges. They drive out some of the Canaanites. They don't do anything else. And they end up worse than the Canaanites by the end of the story. And that's pretty bad. It's pretty bad.
It is. It's our inability to take what God is trying to give us and preferring instead to take what we can take for ourselves. And I don't want to stomp on you too much here, but the Dan story is classic as far as this goes. If Dan does its job, we don't have a Saul problem. We don't have a David problem. The Philistines are Dan's job. And they don't want to do their job. They want to find this cushy place up north and take that place. So it's more easy for them, and they get in trouble going that way, of course. But it's God's work is difficult. It's a challenge to us, and we're sometimes just not up for it.
Nope, not at all. But you're not stepping on my toes because that was not the story I was going to pick. So they get a twofer. So I had a hard time with this because trying to take 5 or just a few minutes to talk about a story in Judges. In Judges, most of the stories are pretty long. It's really kind of exciting like that. But I picked one that I think, in this case, I think I'm picking off what most people would pick. And that is the story of Adoni-bezek in chapter 1, in the first 7 verses. So it says, after the death of Joshua, the people of Israel inquired of the Lord. And they're like, who should go up first for us against the Canaanites to fight against them? You're like, oh, look, this is a retelling of Joshua. It's a conquest narrative. It's going to go great. We know how this goes.
Right.
And the Lord said, well, Judah will go up first. Makes sense. This kind of sweep of how it plays out is exactly how it plays out in the beginning of the book. Goes from Joshua until Dan, Judah until Dan. It's how it plays out in the middle of the book, where our first judge is Othniel from Judah, and our last judge is Samson, who's from Dan. And it's how the end of the book plays out, where we start with a priest from Judah, and we end up with the destruction, playing out in the situation there with Dan. So we have him. He's like, well, Judah's going to go up, behold, I've given him the land. And Judah's like, hey, Simeon, why don't you come up with me, and we'll fight together against the Canaanites, and then I'll help you with your guys. And Simeon goes with him. And then Judah went up with the Lord against the Canaanites and the Perizzites in the land. They defeated 10,000 of them at Bezek, and found Adoni-bezek at Bezek. And they fought against him, and they defeated the Canaanites and the Perizzites. And Adoni-bezek fled, but they pursued him, and they caught him, and they cut off his thumbs and his big toes. And Adoni-bezek said, 70 kings with their thumbs and their big toes, with their cut off, used to pick up scraps from under my table. Well, as I have done, so God has repaid me. And they brought him to Jerusalem, and he died there. This is a weird little story. It's strange. Like, what is this doing in here? But already here in chapter 1, God's inspired narrator has introduced us to a lot of themes that are going to play out later. And at first, they seem innocuous. like Judah asking Simeon to help him capture the land. That seems innocuous. But we know, of course, that the real problem is that no one's going to actually do their job, like you just said with Dan. They're not going to capture the land. They need help, or they won't do it at all. And that's going to be a problem. A little bit later, Aksa is going to request a water source from Caleb for Othniel. At first, we're like, oh, this isn't a big deal. Except we're going to see that later, the fact that men won't go up to fight like Barak and Deborah without a woman leading them. And then, of course, later that gets even worse. Well, that's prefigured here. Or we have this other one, and that's the one I want to kind of focus on for just a few minutes. It's Judah, who is the best tribe, portrayed here, goes and cuts off Adoni-bezek's thumbs and big toes. Now, pop quiz for you.
Oh, great.
No, right? But you asked me an off-topic question, so I get to ask you one.
Okay.
What do we get, or does the law allow for dismemberment as a punishment?
I can't remember an example of.
Only one example, and it's not this. There's the woman who gets in fight, gets her hand cut off. In other words,
right.
Right. So that's the only one, and it's very memorable, right? But this is absolutely not allowed according to the law. But why do they do it? Because it's what the Canaanites do.
Yeah.
And it starts out kind of innocuous because we think, well, this guy's a bad guy. He's a Canaanite. They cut off his thumbs and big toes. It's just retribution. It's lex talionis. That's what he's done. But already they're making a decision to say, we're not going to do what God says. We're going to do it the way they do it. We're going to do what seems right in our own eyes. And the story that begins here in chapter 1 with cutting off the thumbs and big toes of a wicked and evil Canaanite king, it ends in chapter 19 with another story of dismemberment, doesn't it? Mm-hmm. But this time not a wicked Canaanite king, but an innocent concubine of a Levite.
Right.
What starts out innocuous, we see, because they've chosen to do what's right in their own eyes, it's going to end badly. Mm-hmm. It always does.
The trend of chaos, if it is not deliberately stopped, anybody who's ever wrestled with a dirty closet or whatever, laundry problems, we tend toward entropy, a greater and greater state of disorder. And Judges is a perfect example of that. They are supposed to impose God's order on the land, and they don't do that. And by the end of the story, I'm not sure that there is a bigger picture story in this what they usually call the appendix at the end of Joshua, other than the writer saying, this is what happens when you lose control. It's nothing about this is weird. It's just crazy, weird, nutty stuff. What's the big problem? I don't know what the big problem is. It's other than you're drifting away from God. Your society, your culture will fall apart. And crazy things like the concubine dismemberment, like the episode with Micah and the Levite and all of these crazy things. This is what happens when there's not a king in the land.
Yeah.
And to find a king, find a good king. And again, that attaches to Jesus also. Mm-hmm.
And that actually is my verse. This one is a little bit on topic, but again, with a little bit of a twist, because my verse for Judges is Judges 21:25. In those days, there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in his own eyes.
Okay.
Now, here's why I think this is really cool when you read through Judges several times, because at first, we're all like, oh, a good king will fix this, right? Mm-hmm. But let's jump forward in the story, right? Does a good king fix it? No.
Not really.
Now let's look backwards and see if we can connect this a different way. Because as you look and look and look, you realize that it's not just that a good leader is going to fix things, because it's not just the leaders are bad. I mean, think the judges are all wicked, right? Especially you can see this with Gideon, becomes an idolater. Abimelech, makes himself a king. Jephthah sacrifices his daughter. Samson. The tribal leaders are going to do the same thing from the very beginning until the very end, including not just going up, like they're going to go with Dan and fight against Laish and destroy all these innocent people, but they end up destroying the innocence of themselves. Think about it. By the end in chapter 20 and 21, the tribes who refuse to band together to fight against the Canaanites and wipe them out will band together to wipe out one of their own.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the priests are wicked. This Levite, and he's not just any Levite, right? The Levite, we finally found out his name is Jonathan, the son of Gershom, the son of Moses. This is Moses' grandson.
Mm-hmm.
And he is this wicked. And it's the people too, the fathers and the husbands and the generic nameless townspeople. What we see actually is when we read that there was no king in Israel, so everyone does what is right in their own eyes, it is a democratization of evil. This is like the flood, where every person does evil.
Mm-hmm.
Every person. And here, I think this is kind of what this verse is really getting at, especially as we're going to read into Samuel and Kings, right? And it's not like God doesn't know it's not like God doesn't know how the story is going to go, moving forward into Samuel and Kings. It's that if you are expecting, and if you're waiting, think, oh, if only I had one good guy, one king, he'd solve all the problems. But if you don't solve the problems in yourself, that's not going to help. David was the best king Israel ever had. It didn't fix Israel. And it could barely fix David in the second half of his life. I mean, right. Josiah, right? Josiah, probably the second best godly king that you're going to get. Remember, you get hold of the prophetess and everybody else and says, sorry, buddy, I'm still destroying the people. Why? You're righteous, but the people, everybody's doing what's right in their own eyes. And we see that in Joshua and Judges already. Everybody's doing whatever they want to do. And as soon as you decide, like with Adoni-bezek, that you're going to do what you want to do and it doesn't matter what God says in this one place, well, you can say that for anything.
Right.
And here we've got everybody doing what is right in their own eyes, which is, of course, the exact opposite of what is right in God's eyes.
And it usually is. And I have found myself over the last 25 years as a parent attaching most of these generational conflicts to parenting. And if the one generation would teach the other generation, then you break this cycle, you get out of this loop, and you start going on God's path. That may be just overly simplistic. Do we have any real evidence that the supposedly faithful fathers really were all that faithful in the first place? Maybe they didn't teach their children because they hadn't been taught, because they hadn't completely bought into this notion themselves. We have a great tendency to accept chastening and make things right and fix things. I'm sorry. Just like the 12-year-old caught smoking in the garage or whatever. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have done that. And take whatever punishment. You're right, Dad. I'm sorry. But there's a character issue behind this that does not get addressed. And maybe it's not mom and dad's fault. Maybe they're doing the best they can, and this is just a child that's wayward. And this child goes on to teach their children what they know about God, which is maybe a little bit less than their parents, and then the next generation teaches a little bit less. And by generations, we see this drift. But it's not because one particular generation fell down on the job. It's that we never really bought into this idea of faith in the first place. We never became the people of God in the fullest sense of the word.
Yeah. And I think that you see that here as well as kind of throughout the whole scriptures, because in Joshua and Judges, we think, oh, this is a much, much later generation. But if this priest is Moses' grandson, let's kind of like do a little bit of generational math. Moses is a generation older than the wilderness generation, right? Because he's 40 years. He's 80 years when he comes back to Egypt to lead them out. So he's a generation ahead of them. Right. And then all of that generation dies in the wilderness. So Moses is 2 generations ahead of them. So the people that are coming into the land are the age of Moses' grandchildren, which tells us this Levite and this happenstance of what goes on in Judges chapter 19, that is the same generation as Joshua. That's that generation.
A Jordan crosser.
Yeah. He's one of them, and all the people that doing they're the people who crossed the Jordan River. That's them. And that should be, oh no, that could be us.
And I'm prepared to believe, in fact, I'm confident that there are gaps in the record, that sometimes son of refers to descendant of. There may be a bit of a gap there. But you mentioned Othniel before. That's a clear-cut, hard-line measuring stick. Othniel is old enough to marry Caleb's daughter
Mm-hmm.
when they take the land. And after a generation or so, they go to Othniel as their first judge. Okay, we're not talking about 100 years. You're talking about 30 or 40 years at this point. They have already digressed enough to need a leader just virtually on the heels of Caleb's death. If I remember right, they'd been oppressed for 40 years. Usually it's a generation, it's about 40 years or so, and then they call for Othniel. So you're talking about a very short window of time
Yeah.
between supposedly, victorious in the land and needing deliverance.
Absolutely. And we have in this case, I think it's probably not just a gap sort of thing, although I think you're exactly right, because we actually we know who the high priest is in the time of this whole occurrence, and it's Phineas.
Son of Eleazar, son of Aaron.
So this is again grandson. When you get both of them the same thing, that's not just a happenstance, right? Like, because there's only one Finn. This is that's this generation.
Yeah.
That's how badly it didn't take years and years and years to get this badly. Although Judges, of course, covers many years. It's that bad immediately.
Yeah.
Immediately. So
Well, that may or may not have to do with the word that you had chosen, but
well, I'm Terry will be surprised by this. I've been a Debbie Downer about Judges on the whole thing, but I actually picked a word that I think is a positive word for the book of Judges, and that is because the Judges tells two stories. The one that I focus on with my story and with my summary and with my verse is how bad the people are. But for my word, I want to pick the word raised. And this is one that God uses a lot. So in Judges 2:16, the Lord raised up judges. In Judges 2:18, the Lord raised up judges. Over and over and over and over and over, we read the Lord raised up judges to save his people. Now, we're all familiar with the cycle. The people sin, they're enslaved, they cry out, but this is the other side of the story. And that this is what God does. He raises up people and he saves sinners. And he provides salvation and provides a savior and provides a deliverer to sinful people. The whole reason God sends his son to earth to die on a Roman cross is so that what is mortal might put on immortality, so that what is dead might be swallowed up by life, and so that what is fallen and sinful, like all the people of Judges, might be raised in new life. And that's what we see God do in the book of Judges. They're terrible. God says he's going to abandon them. He says it several times, and yet he still doesn't. He still raises up a judge. And I think we get a really wonderful picture about God here, is that this is a God who we have a God who resurrects. That's, in the New Testament, raise and resurrect are the same thing.
right.
That's who God is. And if God can care about and love and seek to save the people, the judges, God can care about and love and seek to save me and you and everybody else, because that's what God does. He raises people up.
I'm glad you said that, because I'm like everybody else, I suppose. There's a lot of negative in Judges. There's a lot of bad lessons, and I am constantly connecting the Judges' story to our story as the people of God. I mentioned a few minutes ago, and what a heartwarming thing it is to know that God doesn't quit on us. That He gives us a chance. We blow it. Well, we're done. We're out of here. God is so patient with us and so forgiving, and we're not going to get it right the first time, and we may not get it right the 20th time, but he's continuing to persevere with us, and we're doing the best we can, and we're teaching another generation, and maybe it'll work out, maybe it won't, but it won't be because God wasn't loving toward us. There's always going to be a window of opportunity for us to find faith, to find hope. Great story. Well, our time is more than up. Thank you very much, Jared, for stopping in. Thanks for your insights. It's been a great study. I'm sure that we're all profited by it. Thanks always to Jerry Tesh and the fellows at Narrow Way for providing the music in our intro. Check them out at www.narrowway.com. Be reading Ruth and 1 Samuel for next time. And check out my other podcast, Citizen of Heaven. If you like what you're hearing, like, share, and subscribe. Until then, this is Hal Hammons, and we'll see you next week. Read your Bible.